Okay. So Rita Dove has a new book coming out called Playlist for the Apocalypse. And when I was on retreat, I read this great line in a poem about COVID times. The poem was by Christine Valters Paintner, and she wrote, "You had never imagined before how tedious the apocalypse would sometimes be." I thought that was a fabulous description of COVID times. And so that's this word that we hear, right? Apocalypse. The Greek is apocalypsis, and that's the Greek title of this book of scripture. And we have come to use the word apocalypse to mean the kind of end times and destruction, but that's not actually what the Greek means. If you have an English translation of the Bible, you know the translation of apocalypsis is revelation. Or one of a translation I like, one of the scholars says it's an unveiling. So apocalypse isn't really about the end of the world. It's about the revealing of the holy and the divine in our midst. And of course, apocalyptic literature is a whole genre. I hope that some of you were able to watch the little video that I linked to that talks about apocalyptic literature in the Bible. The book of Revelation is the only place that we get an entire book of apocalyptic literature, but there are pieces of it throughout. Karen read from Isaiah at the very beginning of the service, where these winged creatures are at the throne of God singing holy, holy, holy. And in Ezekiel 1, it's a little longer passage, so I decided not to read the whole thing, but this prophet has a vision of four winged creatures who have four faces. They have the face of a human, the face of an ox, the face of an eagle, and the face of a lion. So that should all sound pretty familiar, having just read from the book of Revelation. So you can see that John borrows a lot from these other apocalyptic works in the Old Testament, like to the extent if he was in my English class, I would probably write him up for plagiarism. He just takes these entire images and sticks them in there. And that also means that these images that are pretty disconcerting to me, and I imagine to many of you, would actually have felt, most of John's readers would have been much more familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, what we have as our Old Testament texts, than we are. So these would be familiar, maybe even comforting images to a lot of those first readers, because they're coming straight out of the Jewish scriptures. And another piece of apocalyptic literature, there are these symbols and ideas and unveilings of the mystery. And apocalyptic writing also tended to be very political. And that's something that's really relevant, I think, if we try to explore the depths of Revelation in these coming weeks. I think of it somewhat in parallel to some science fiction and fantasy writers today, like think about Octavia Butler or Margaret Atwood, who create these scenarios that are different times and different places, but they're very much speaking to and about contemporary political situations. But because it's a fantasy realm, there's sort of a plausible deniability. So if the emperor read what John wrote and got mad about it, John could just say, oh no, that's not about you. That's about winged creatures with a bunch of eyes. You don't have to do anything to me. It's not about you. But John knew, and John's readers knew, and we can tell today that it is very much about the emperor and the Roman Empire and how Christians should relate to the empire. And the author, John, has a particular interest in this topic because he's writing from the island of Patmos, not on a tropical vacation, but banished there for preaching and speaking about Jesus. So he is, in a sense, in political exile as he's writing the book of Revelation. And he's thinking a lot about what his faith is in relation to the governing authorities. And the Roman Empire presented a pretty tricky situation for the Jewish and Christian people as monotheists who would only worship one God, while in the Roman Empire, there was an expectation of emperor worship. It was fine to worship other gods too, but you definitely should also worship the emperor. And ever since Augustus had ended the 200-year civil war, about 30 years before Jesus' birth, some of you on here know much more about the history than I do. So if I get facts wrong, put in the chat, correct me in the chat. But about 30 years after, before Jesus' birth, Augustus had established the Pax Romana, right? This peace where the civil war was ended. And so the people, one commentary I read wanted to make sure that we understood it was the people in the Roman Empire that promoted and that kept this emperor worship going. They saw that as sort of the price they had to pay for having the peace and stability to the extent that they had it. And I suppose that there was a lot of peer pressure to participate in this emperor worship. And you might have felt some of this, you know, in the pledging allegiance to the flag at school, or the national anthem before different sporting events, or I'm really immersed in it. Amy probably has this experience a lot. Anytime I go to Branson, it's like everything you do there starts with rah-rahing the military and, you know, the flag waving and all of this. And it's not that there are government officials walking around forcing people to do these things. It's the part of the culture, and it's pretty awkward when you're not completely comfortable with that, when you're not on board. And the Jews and Christians in the Roman Empire were always in that position of feeling really awkward and not quite sure how they were supposed to be interacting. So yes, many of the Roman citizens, I'm sure, enthusiastically participated in the emperor worship, and also the powers that be, the governmental powers absolutely encouraged and even demanded the worship. You know, Pontius Pilate, who you probably remember from Jesus' crucifixion, he caused this whole big to-do in Jerusalem when he came in with these icons. He brought in icons of the emperor into the holy city, and that was not well received. Emperor Nero, in the middle of the 1st century, this guy was a piece of work. Oh my goodness. But one of the things he did was he built a 120-foot statue of himself as the god Apollo that he stuck in the city. And my favorite was Caligula, who was just before Nero. He went around, he cut the heads off of a bunch of the god statues and stuck new heads on that looked like him. So all the god statues had Caligula's head on them. So yeah, I mean, the emperors were definitely facilitating the emperor worship, and the people were going along with it. And I know this is a lot more historical context than I usually give in my sermons, and there's a whole lot of context that I'm leaving out. I know things are really bad and hard right now. I will say, if you're feeling discouraged about US Canadian political situation, you can go read a little bit about the Roman Empire and maybe feel a little better about where we are right now. But I just think that this historical context is absolutely essential if we want to have a faithful reading of the book of Revelation. And when John's fantastical visions are pulled out of this context, that's when we get these really problematic interpretations about, you know, the mark of the beast being encoded in the vaccine, or this person or that person being the Antichrist, or this news headline or that news headline signaling the end of the world. All of those interpretations of Revelation are not attentive to the historical context that John was writing in and the people he was trying to communicate with. But within that historical context, I think this might be one of the most Mennonite Anabaptist books in the Bible. And I hope some of this background kind of sticks around in your head as we go through in the 4 Sundays on Revelation. But I want to focus in now a little bit just on the passage from Revelation 4 that Karen read for us. I started this week, I've been reading this book, Apocalypse and Allegiance. It's by Nelson Crable, who used to be the president at Anabaptist Mennonite Seminary. It's Worship, Politics, and Devotion in the Book of Revelation. And he spends a lot of the introduction, he spends some time talking about this cult of emperor worship. And then, because he's a teacher at heart, he says, now that you finish the introduction, put this book down and go read the book of Revelation and then come back. And because I am a very good student, I put the book down and I went and I read the book of Revelation. And the first 3 chapters are fascinating, but it was here in chapter 4, after having read his introduction, I really just stopped me in my tracks when I read, the 24 elders fall before the one who is seated on the throne and worship the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne. Now, in a culture that relies on emperor worship to maintain civic unity and peace, John presents this image of the people who wear crowns taking off their crowns and bowing down before the one true God. And they sing, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power." It is also probably not a coincidence that Domitian, who was the emperor possibly while John was writing, or maybe just slightly before John wrote, but very much in people's minds, the Emperor Domitian required people to refer to him as Lord and God. So John is intentionally referring to God as Lord and God. And so this image that John gives us of the divine throne room is not only strange and a little disconcerting, but it is very subversive. According to this vision, worldly powers are not to be worshiped, but are ultimately part of God's creation that owes God worship and praise. And Crable writes that these visions in Revelation 4 and then Revelation 5 that we'll look at next week, these visions set out an alternative pattern of allegiance and worship. It's an alternative to the emperor empire worship that was so prevalent in the Roman Empire. And we could, and it's lots of fun, so we can have coffee and do this sometime this week if you want. I mean, we could dig into what all of the symbols are, like all the animals and the numbers and the stones. It's fascinating. And the bottom line is simply that everyone and everything owes worship to God. And that is a claim that threatens the very foundation of the Pax Romana. So I say this is a very Mennonite text because I think Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, not exclusively, but to a larger extent than many other Christian traditions, has paid a lot of attention to these forces of empire over the years. Right? We care about how those forces hurt God's people and God's creation. We call out the ways that those forces pressure us to be less faithful to the way of Jesus. I mean, the earliest Anabaptists were persecuted for the refusal to baptize infants. And we tend to think of that as a theological issue, which it is. And also in the 16th century, it was very much a political issue because with refusing to baptize babies disrupted the state's mechanism for collecting taxes and for conscripting people for war because the baptismal registries were the census. So it wasn't only a theological, it wasn't only because of the theology that the state opposed Anabaptist practice of adult baptism. And over again throughout the centuries, Anabaptists' refusal to participate in war, and in some cases even to pay taxes that support war, have subverted the political powers and called out the false peace of empire and provided a witness against the cult of the emperor. So for us as contemporary readers of Revelation, I think the central question is, what does it mean in our context to refuse and even to subvert the cult of empire worship? Now you might say, Joanna, what are you talking about? Nobody worships emperors anymore. Except I don't think many of you would say that because you are all understand that the cult of empire is alive and well in 21st century America. And I told Ann, I promised Ann Bailey I would bring my trip to Las Vegas into the sermon somehow about Revelation, which actually isn't that hard. Here's my Caesar's Palace gold card from the casinos. And gold, by the way, is the lowest card. They did not get much of my money in the casino. I was not upgraded to a higher status than gold. And Las Vegas is sort of the America on steroids. I mean, it's an exaggeration of everything, but this idea of over conspicuous consumption, right? And this sort of glorifying of, Caesar, it's called Caesar's, right? The empire of the economy it's making the rich richer and the poor poorer. It's caused a situation where some people can't even afford to live and other people have more money, literally more money than they know what to do with, as you will see if you go to Vegas. The recent news on climate change and the fires and all of the natural disasters that are just getting worse and worse is revealing that our sacrifice to the gods of economy and convenience and comfort has destroyed not just the environment, but even our own lives. The empire of individualism and individual rights, right? We talked about this during sharing time. People are dying of COVID. People are dying of gun violence because of this empire we've created around individualism. The empire of security insists that we have to have protection at any price. The empire of political parties demands unquestioning loyalty and party line votes. And the empire of nationalism demands allegiance to country above and beyond compassion for people, even above and beyond allegiance to God. So we may not have an emperor going around sticking his head on God statues, but we certainly have plenty of powers demanding allegiance today. And what would it look like if the lion, ox, human, eagle, creatures oozing eyes were to lead these crowned powers in worship of the one true God, the God who offers love and peace and compassion for all? What would it look like for our nations, our political parties, our individualistic ideologies, our criminal justice systems, our economies to remove their crowns and to bow down before God, who insists on universal love and justice, who expresses power through vulnerability, who grants a peace beyond what any empire can offer? What would it look like? I can't imagine. I can sooner picture the crazy winged creatures and that rainbow, emerald rainbow, than I can imagine what a world like that would look like. I can't imagine it. But that's why we have prophets like John of Patmos, because they can imagine. They can share God's revelation, God's unveiling with us. And while we can't fully grasp it, maybe we can find some peace in just knowing that the vision exists, that the vision is out there in the world. I can't imagine, but that's why we have worship, why we have this odd time each week when we gather together to try to turn ourselves a little more away from the empire and a little more towards God, to try to imagine what a world better oriented to God would even look like, and to try to figure out how we might be even a small part of that turning. I can't imagine, and probably you can't imagine, but maybe together we can imagine it just a little bit. Thanks be to God.